Thank you for joining us for this special Up to Speed conversation. It was a year ago today. George Floyd was killed at the hands of a police officer. As the world watched this traumatic footage from Minneapolis, many of us took time to engage in raw and often difficult discussions among family, friends, colleagues, and we hope to make today's discussion more of a reflection as we pause to remember this day, 1 year later. And joining me to help guide us through this conversation, Marie McGehee from our communications team. Marie has personally helped myself and so many of our communications colleagues understand the gravity of these tough discussions and how we can all continue to forge a path. And Marie, I just want to say, we've had so many conversations like this, you and I personally, and they've all meant the world to me. It's an honor to be with you today. I wanted to go back to last year with you in the immediate days after George Floyd. Those were some tough times for our team. What was your reaction?
Well, thanks so much for having me, Andy. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. And my immediate reaction, when I think back to that time, it was really difficult. We were already living and getting used to the global pandemic and what that meant for all of us personally and professionally. We had already heard the news and seen the footage of Arbery and what transpired there in Georgia. We saw the news over the Memorial Day weekend of Christian Cooper as he was bird watching in Central Park. And then we saw the awful footage of George Floyd being murdered before our very eyes. So all of that, combined together, was really difficult to process. And with the exception of the pandemic, all of these other events, even though those types of events are not new in the United States and around the world, certainly, I think the combination of all of that together and seeing it before our very eyes was really difficult to process. And many of us were working from home, myself included, and so with that, there was no separation between work and home anymore. Oftentimes we see these horrible events play out and then we put our hurt work hat on and we try to pretend like nothing happened. Well, there was no way that that was going to happen following George Floyd and all of the other events that I mentioned.
Yeah, and I remember some of the calls that we had as a team. And there was one particular where you mentioned to us, hey, I'm having a tough time and we all are having some tough times here. We should pause and think about sort of how we can help each other. It really galvanized my own thoughts and my heart to think about what others are feeling in those moments. It was such a difficult time beyond just the fact that we were in a different environment with the pandemic. But when major news events occur and they unfold, of course, our communications team, the Up to Speed team, we spring into action. If you can, though, can you share a little bit about what happened and how that moment with Hans on June 1st, how that moment unfolded behind the scenes?
So I remember, as you said, we had a team discussion, about what was Verizon going to say. And, fortunately, there was never a question about what we were going to say or the fact that Verizon would actually say something. It was how do we make sure that we say it so that it doesn't appear empty. And so the whole weekend after George Floyd's murder, we were working throughout the weekend on our comms team and across many stakeholders, our VLC, or many of our senior leaders, our board, just ensuring that everybody was aligned on what the message was going to be, but also the action that followed suit.
Yeah, and just looking back at that statement from Hans, it was such an iconic moment there. But in those words, Hans also announced a $10 million donation from Verizon to 7 social justice organizations, including the National Urban League, NAACP. But Marie, this wasn't necessarily the first time that we were working with these organizations, correct?
Yeah, I mean, fortunately for Verizon, I mean, many of the organizations who we announced that were part of that $10 million donation, we had been working with for many years. You know, the NAACP, we have a longstanding relationship with them, National Urban League, you know, and you go down the line. So this was not the first time that they were hearing from us. We, you know, are deeply rooted in the communities that they serve, and working with them side by side to advance policy, you know, whether it's criminal justice reform, to advance their work on in the education space, to advance their work on voter rights. So these were longstanding relationships, but what was different in the moment of George Floyd and the immediate aftermath was that suddenly the entire world sort of sat up and took notice of what had been happening for many, many years. And the bar, as Hans more recently said, got set much higher than what had been, you know, set before.
Looking back at this past year, you think about any moment in time, there was always a conversation happening among our peers, among our communications team, folks across the business. We've had so many conversations about race. Are you surprised at how it galvanized so many people in our company to have similar conversations, as difficult as those conversations are?
I'm not surprised because, you know, Hans as a leader has really shown, you know, shown the company who, you know, what he values and really and, you know, what we stand for as a company well before, you know, George Floyd. And so as a result of, you know, how he delivered the statement, you know, on June 1st of last year, that really opened the door and gave space for so many of our leaders and so many employees to have these conversations, right? Because oftentimes when these horrible news events happen, it's very easy to think about them in terms of like a headline or a hashtag. But what is also really important to acknowledge is that many of our employees, and our customers, frankly, if they are not necessarily in the headlines, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not having similar experiences of not feeling like they belong, or being marginalized or having macro and microaggressions. So it was really important for us to bring up these conversations and allow our employees in their own words to share their stories of, you know, when they were in law school and, you know, a professor questioning whether they belonged in the room, or, you know, if they're sitting in, you know, one of our offices or in our, you know, or working in one of our stores, and then they take a break and then they go out and grab lunch, that they're immediately racially profiled by someone, and, you know, questioning whether they belong. These are real day-to-day experiences, and sometimes we sort of separate like, oh, this happened over here. But I think the big awakening across our company and around the world was that many of the people who we all interact with every day have very similar experiences, and not just isolated in the Black community. We're seeing this play out in all communities, like Asian, as we've talked about very recently,
Mhm.
people with disabilities, and most recently, you know, the surge in violence that we've seen in the Jewish community here in the United States as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you mentioned, the idea of opening doors. It certainly has strengthened the confidence of so many, including myself, to really speak about my own identity, especially, when things were happening in the Asian community. And as you mentioned, right now in the Middle East, there's just, it's one of those situations where I believe more conversations will empower more of our colleagues to continue these type of dialogue, and it's a beautiful thing. It can often be a painful thing, but certainly it's a situation where everyone wants to be acknowledged, and the fact that we're pledging money, we're having conversations, it's great. But Marie, talk to us about the actions here, because you've been so uh, you know you've been so right about making sure that we attach actions to these words. So, what are some of the things that Verizon is doing on social justice that stand out the most to you?
Sure. I mean, part of it is to make sure that we are also very educated in all of these issues because you can't really create action if you don't understand, at the core what some of the issues are. So, in addition to having conversations within our four walls amongst our employees and our leaders who've been so courageous in sharing their stories, we've also brought in a number of community leaders and activists to really educate on us all across all of these issues and really give voice to the issues so that we can create the action. So, coming out of George Floyd last year, we created a race and social justice action plan. This was led by our leadership team at Verizon, and it had three pillars, right? Continuing the conversation. So, as I said before, and as we've been talking about, Andy, we've had many courageous conversations. We have a series called Next 20, where we're giving voice to community leaders and activists to educate us on these issues. We've also really been even more intentional about creating a strong organization. So we've had a lot of upticks in a lot of the training that we offer, whether it's unconscious bias training, how to be anti-racist, conscious inclusion, and not just training, but also looking at how we're hiring and also developing and retaining talent across all levels. Oftentimes, when companies talk about their diverse talent pipelines, they may talk, at a very entry level point, and yes, it definitely has to start there with HBCUs and other organizations and the like. We also have to ensure that we are also developing and promoting in the middle and at the most senior levels of the organization all of our diverse talent, right? And then lastly, the community engagement piece. Like I said, when George Floyd, was murdered last year, this was not the first time that Verizon was engaging with the organizations that we announced as part of that $10 million donation. We've had longstanding relationships with all of them to advance, criminal justice reform and, supplier diversity, so many different things. Verizon Innovative Learning, which has been around for 10 years, that initiative really has been focused on bridging the digital divide well before people understood what the digital divide, actually meant. And now everyone does as a result of COVID. And so we have been, very intentional and proactive, I should say. And the only difference is that we're doubling down on many of the efforts that started several years ago.
And Marie, we've been talking about small business from the beginning of this pandemic. Within the scope of this conversation, we've been doing quite a bit as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So from the start of the pandemic, we sprung into action with Pay It Forward Live, which was our concert series where we were partnering with a wide range of influencers from Billie Eilish to Alicia Keys to really champion small businesses. And we raised close to $8 million through that effort, and 40+% of the grants that went to small businesses went to Black owned businesses. So, again, before George Floyd, and we continue to find different ways to champion, all types of small businesses, whether they're Black owned or women owned businesses and the like.
And Marie, I want to make sure we talk about volunteering. So much of what we've done as V Teamers Giving Back has been to ensure that racial justice is a part of the conversation.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought that up, Andy, because, in addition to having the tough conversations, many of our employees, found a way to express their support of these issues through the Citizen Verizon Volunteer Portal. And so we saw that last year where they were engaging directly with many of the organizations that we donated money to and continue to do that today, those volunteer activities that we offer for social justice are among our most popular with employees.
What would you say is your biggest takeaway from this past year?
My biggest takeaway is that, regardless of which community we are talking about whether it's the Black community, the Asian community, Hispanic, Latinx, people with disabilities, women, Jewish community, Muslims, across the board, there's a shared, at the end of the day, we're all human. And so we all, have human connection, and Verizon at its core, that's what we do as a business. So we are all about human connection through technology and through the products and services that we serve, that we sell, and then also helping people to realize their full potential. And if we start with from a place of empathy and kindness and love, that will get us through it. And that transcends any sort of specific group, any political affiliation, and what have you. In fact, I have this bracelet here that I wear every day.
I
I don't know
love
if you
it.
can see it, but it's my love. So all you need is love, Andy.
Well, Marie, thank you for sharing that love. And once again, it is an honor to work alongside you to build those stories of love. And as you said, the world continues to look for, and hopefully we continue to give that love. And it really starts from yourself. And we'll continue to share those stories of kindness, of love, bringing us closer together here on Up to Speed. But once again, Marie, thank you so much for spending some time with us. And of course, thank you to everyone for listening to this very important conversation and pausing and reflecting with us. Until next time, you're Up to Speed.